one of my favorite quote is come from Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the European Union. He said that we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it.
Welcome to VoxDevTalks. My name is Tim Phillips. In October 2024, Prabowo Subianto assumed the presidency of Indonesia, and he inherits the goal of the Golden Indonesia vision. By the time the country celebrates 100 years of independence in 2045, it aims to be one of the 4 or 5 largest economies in the world. But if Indonesia remains dependent on commodity exports like palm oil, coal, natural gas and rubber, does it risk getting stuck in the middle income trap? It's too wealthy to compete with low-wage nations, but without the human capital or the technology to become a high-income country. Chatib Basri is an economist and a former Finance Minister of Indonesia, and he has strong views on the industrial policies needed to accelerate Indonesia's economic growth and to diversify its exports. He joins me now. Chatib, welcome to VoxDevTalks.
Thank you very much for having me, Tim.
Chatib, either side of the Asian crisis in the late 90s, Indonesia's economy, it has experienced sustained and strong growth. How persistent and how strong has this growth been?
I would say that our economy is doing relatively well. Because, for example, in the last 10 years, the economy continued to grow about 5%, which is based on the global standard, we'll consider good. But my concern is by 2050, Indonesia will start to enter the aging population. So if we continue to maintain this economic growth only by 5%, there is a risk for us is too old to get rich. So that is why acceleration of this economic growth is very important. And our window opportunity is limited because if we start to enter the aging population by 2050, it means that we only 25 more years to go. That is why there is a need to accelerate the economic growth.
I mean, speaking from Europe, the idea of sustained 5% economic growth sounds wonderful, but I do understand what you mean. The growth that has happened recently in the last couple of decades, how much has that changed the lives of the people who live in Indonesia?
Back on 2003, the percentage of the so-called the middle class in Indonesia was around 4% at the time. 2018, this percentage of middle class jumped to around 23%. So it shows that this economic growth improved significantly in many aspects. But after 2019, we are facing a problem of the declining of the share middle class. So the share of middle class dropped from 23% to now around 17% for a couple of reasons. The first one is COVID. But this happened in 2019 before the COVID. So probably one of the big issues for Indonesia is the ability to create jobs in the formal sector. From 2009 to 2040, most of the jobs that have been created were basically in the formal sector. And that's really boosts people in the middle class to earn more income, etc. But from 2019 to 2024, most of the jobs that have been created were basically in the informal sector. Mm-hmm. And this is typical in Indonesia because we don't have the unemployment insurance like in many European countries. So open unemployment could be a misleading indicator. Why is that? Because we don't have the unemployment insurance. So only the rich people could afford to be unemployed. If you are rich, then you can stay at home because you have the non-labor income. But if you are poor, you have to work. But because the formal job is not available, so they go to the informal sector, in the informal trading, etc., when the productivity is relatively low.
For the good side, the good things that have happened in Indonesia's economy, what policies have created that growth? What reforms in Indonesia's economy have created that growth?
Couple of things. Of course, from the 2004-2014, Indonesia enjoyed a commodity boom, really boost the economic growth, increase the income per capita. But there is a risk for it because with the commodity boom, Indonesia experienced what I call the mild Dutch disease. If you look at the share of the manufacturing sector to GDP steadily decline. And then the investment shift into natural resources. So there is probably this explain about this, what Danny Rodriguez called the premature deindustrialization. You mentioned about how Indonesian economy, especially export, highly concentrated on commodity. So in the one hand, this boosts the economic growth in the short term, but the issue is about the sustainability. And I'm concerned about it for two reasons. The first one is because the commodity boom shift the investment from the manufacturing into the natural resources. The second one, this is related to the issue of this political economy, because one of the biggest challenges in Indonesia is bureaucratic hurdles, the high cost economy, the investment climate. Even when I was in the cabinet, I openly said that one of the reasons of why many Indonesians become religious is because they have to deal with the government. If the investor try to apply for their investment, there is nothing they can do except pray to God because there's a lot of uncertainty. So you can imagine in manufacturing sector, we are a price taker. So if there is an issue about the high cost economy, we cannot pass on this burden to the consumer. The consumer will buy products from other country. So with the high cost economy, they will narrow the profit margin. So not much incentive for people to invest on the manufacturing sector. But the situation is different in the natural resources, because in the natural resources, we are a price setter. We are the largest producer of coal, of nickel. You can set the price. So if there is an issue on this bribery, in the issue of corruption, the high cost economy, they could pass on this burden to the consumer. So they could maintain the profit margin. So because the profit margin in the natural resources sector is much higher than the manufacturing sector, then this shift investment from the manufacturing into natural resources. I don't think this will be sustainable. The solution is the economic deregulation. This current president already announced last April that he will do the economic deregulation. He will convert quota, import quota, for example, into tariff. He will change the local content requirement, basically remove the bureaucratic hurdles. What we need to do is just to see the implementation.
We have also seen industrial policy in Indonesia. One of the most public was this basket of policies called Making Indonesia 4.0. So that was targeting increased sophistication in manufacturing with that idea to diversify exports, move away from commodities. Indonesia's progress in manufacturing these sophisticated products, how does this compare to other countries in East Asia, first of all?
I have to say, Tim, that I'm very careful in this industrial policy.
Yeah.
Because in our experience, the government tried to implement the industrial policy in the 70s, early 80s, and end up with the issue of the rent-seeking activities. Government is very bad at picking winner, but losers are very good in picking government. So that is why I am very careful with this industrial policy. But there is a need for that. I've done the calculation to look at about the composition of the Indonesian export based on the intensive margin, extensive margin, development of the new products. Probably about 70% of Indonesian export is the old product in the old market.
Right.
So if you're talking about the new product discovery, is pretty small. It's perhaps less than 5%. So you can imagine that this export is highly concentrated on natural resources, coal, nickel, palm oil, and then this followed the boom-bust cycle, whereas manufacturing is pretty much stable. So that is why, in my view, there is a need to diversify the export from natural resources to manufacturing. But this will require prerequisites, human capital, infrastructure, R&D, financing, all this issue that we need to be resolved. And then the government now, they are trying to come up with the industrial policy for downstreaming.
Yes, that is effectively an export ban to encourage direct investment from overseas into processing within the country to be able to kickstart that sophistication in manufacturing. Is that correct?
Because in the past, we export the raw materials like nickel ore. By imposing the export ban, then the investor should come to Indonesia to make it the processed nickel, become a ferronickel, stainless steel. Now, that's what we call the downstreaming. Indonesia is one of the largest producer of nickel. The government imposed the export ban on nickel. Our export for stainless steel increased from the $2 billion in probably around 2015 to become around $30 billion. This perhaps looks successful, but we have to remember this policy of export ban maybe will not be sustainable, because when the relative price of nickel increase, this will induce innovation in other countries. People will think in the future, if you want to produce battery for EV, because the price of nickel become very expensive because the export ban, then probably they will find the other product as an innovation. If you recall what happened in the 70s in the Middle East, when the Middle East countries imposed the oil embargo, the renewable energy kick in the 80s, right? Probably this program will not be sustainable. The second aspect is, if you impose the export ban, there is a risk of the overproduction. And the third part is, this kind of policy is perhaps industry specific. If you're talking about nickel, because we are a price setter, we are the largest producers, the investment should come to Indonesia to work on this. If you extend this policy into bauxite, people probably will go to Guyana because Guyana will produce more bauxite. Industrial policy is needed, but what the government should do is more on the supply side, like induce a policy for training. Let me give an example to make it clear. In the 70s, most of the Indonesian bankers were Citibank alumni. Why? Because Citibank have the excellent executive development program. So I could imagine, rather than the government create the so-called the training center, why don't we ask the private sector to provide a training? Because they do understand what really needed on the job training. But if we ask the private sector to do a training, then the question is, what's in it for me? So that is why I can see the role of the government. Perhaps the government could give the double deduction for tax if they do training. And this is part of what I call the industrial policy. I call it a lean industrial policy. Because if you introduce the old type of the industrial policy, I don't think this will boost the productivity. Actually, Tim, I was the Minister of Finance when the industrial policy was announced by the government in 2014. But I was reluctant to impose the export ban. What we used at that time was export tax. So if you don't build the smelter, then we provide prohibitive export tax. But if you build, let's say, 30% of the smelter to process nickel into ferronickel or stainless steel, then we lower the export tax. Once you produce the entire smelter, then no more export tax. So the price will be a competitive market. In my view, this kind of policy is more WTO friendly, is more market friendly, is more transparent, and this will boost the competition for the company as well. Because at the end of the day, they have to compete to the world price. But in 2017 or 18, I believe, the government decided to come up with the new policy and introduce the export ban.
The EU has challenged the export ban. The WTO, where the EU has challenged it, it's not very strong at the moment. But again, this might be a threat to the sustainability of policy implemented in this way.
Precisely. My view is we need to do something. As I said, we need to diversify our export. But the best way to do it is to use export tax rather than export ban. And that is consistent with the rule base of the WTO for many countries in the world.
You mentioned developing human capital, R&D spending. These are effective policies, but they also take a very long time to change the composition of exports. Does Indonesia have time to do this?
Maybe the answer is no, but we have to do it. That is why I think the shortest route to do so, or the shortcut to do so, is to expect the technology transfer from the foreign direct investment. If we have to build on ourselves, that will be very difficult. But the question is whether the foreign investors are willing to share this technology. That is why the incentive of double deduction for tax is very important. In the case of automotive, for example, Daihatsu put the Indonesia as a production base, and now they start to export to Japan. So the source of this R&D, it's come from the foreign direct investment. If we want to boost the investment, if we want to boost the quality of human capital, we have to be open to foreign direct investment.
How problematic is the fracturing of the global economy for Indonesia, where we're seeing globalization replaced by regional trade blocs?
This is really a big issue. In the past, we economists, we believe comparative advantage. So we produce things based on the economic efficiency, the economic logic. But after COVID, many countries realized that in the past, we believed that this globalization is the source of prosperity. But now, globalization become the source of uncertainty. If you become too dependent on other countries, you'll be in trouble. Look at what happened in Europe when Russia stopped the export for gas to Germany, for example. And you are in a difficult situation. That is why, since the 2020, we can see the role of the economic security become more dominant. And people start to think, maybe the inventory method should change from the just in time into just in case, because it's fine for you to pay higher costs as long as you have enough stock. So this global situation somehow put us, not only Indonesia, but many countries all over the world in a very difficult situation. And then to make things worse, if you look at the report produced by the IMF, it shows that many critical mineral product, agriculture product are produced by only probably about 3 to 4 countries at the most, 60%. So if one of these countries imposing the export ban, all of a sudden you could see the impact on the increase of the food price, nickel, for example, or other critical minerals. That's really create a problem. So a country like Indonesia, we also facing the same problem. The question is what we should do. This is back to our theme, our central discussion. I think it is very important for us to diversify not only our export, even we need to diversify the source of our supply chain. We cannot rely only on one particular country. And then the way I look at it, a country like Indonesia, we have an opportunity on this. Let me give an example about the trade war between US and China. Maybe some investors will try to reallocate their investment from China in order to access the US market. And that's explained why some investment went to Vietnam, to Bangladesh for the ready-made garment, and will come to Indonesia. But the prerequisite is the investment will come provided you have a good investment climate. This will back to my main argument. Economic deregulation is a very important, because if you want to attract foreign direct investment, you have to streamline the government regulation, you have to remove the bureaucratic hurdles, you have to improve the quality of human capital. That's back to our main discussion again about the importance of this economic deregulation.
We've been discussing industrial policy a lot in the last 20 minutes. It was something that economists never spoke about until fairly recently. But you have been on both sides of this, on the academic side, but also the person who is in charge of implementing these policies. From your experience, what is good policy and what is bad policy when it comes to countries like Indonesia? There are many countries that are faced with the same sorts of problems that Indonesia is grappling with now.
I think the first question that we have to ask, what is the externality issue? If there is an externality, then there is a need for the government to intervene. The second one is whether the government has the capability to direct the so-called industrial policy. And I do understand in my experience in the government, the biggest challenge is the capacity of the bureaucracy, the risk of the rent seeking. I'm very careful on this industrial policy. I think we need lean industrial policy. Intervene, but you focus on the supply side rather than demand side. Supply side means that you improve the quality of human capital, you encourage R&D, maybe because the market is very competitive, your profit margin is very low, and there is no incentive for the people to do the innovation, for example. But innovation is very important. So somehow there is a room for the government in terms of the R&D, in terms of human capital, or if you're talking about infrastructure, you can't expect that the private sector will provide their own infrastructure. It should be a government. Or you're going to create a sort of like coordination problem to ensure the externality, the ecosystem will be created by this policy. There is a justification. But if you go further, try to regulate everything, there is a risk that will be end up with the issue of the rent-seeking activities. Especially if you're talking about specific sector, you create a local content regulation, you create a sort of like import quota, then the one people who get the political connection to the government will take the benefit of it. That's a description about good and bad policy in terms of this government intervention.
There's a new political regime in Indonesia at the moment. From what you have seen so far, do you have confidence that they will implement industrial policy in this way?
One of my favorite quotes is come from Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the European Union. He said that we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. So this is the political reality. We're probably not living in the first best world. We're probably living in the second best world and run by the third best bureaucracy. As a former policymaker, I'm humbled by the political reality. The issue is how to work within constraint.
So Indonesia has these ambitions by 2050, as you say, to become a high-income country. As you say, also, time is short and there is that demographic problem that it is struggling with. What's your level of confidence that Indonesia will be able to achieve its goals?
Okay, bear with me if I'm talking about number. One of the biggest challenge for us is productivity. So for 1% economic growth will require investment of a GDP about 6.8%. It's very high. The President Prabowo, he specifically mentioned that his target is to achieve the 8% economic growth by 2029. I can understand this ambition. And as I said to you, we need to accelerate the economic growth. But if we want to grow by 8%, it means that we need investment of the GDP 8 multiplied by 6.8, right? So you're talking about investment over GDP more than 50%. It's probably around 54%, very high. Our gross domestic savings now is only around 37%. So there is a huge saving investment gap. And this will be reflected on the current account deficit. And I don't think, because nowadays, if your current account deficit is financed through the portfolio, every time your current account deficit go beyond 3%, the country with a current account deficit higher than 3% always is being punished by the market. Yeah, look at what happened in 2013. I had to manage the taper tantrum because the current account deficit at that time was around 4.4%. When Chair Bernanke decided to unwind the quantitative easing, there was a huge capital outflow from the emerging market from Indonesia, Turkey, South Africa, India, and Brazil at that time. It's not possible unless we solve this problem of the saving investment gap. We have to improve the productivity. So for the same investment over GDP, will create or produce higher economic growth. If we could reduce the incremental capital output ratio from 6.8 to become 5, if you want to grow by 8%, you only need investment over GDP around 40%. If you want to improve the productivity, it means that the government need to improve the human capital, which could be done by providing this double deduction for tax, encourage the private sector, the foreign direct investment to create a training. The second aspect is to continue to build an infrastructure. Third aspect is improve the governance, because we cannot continue like this with the issue of the corruption. Let me be frank and honest with you. The problem with the corruption, I hate to say this, is about uncertainty. During the Suharto era, the previous Indonesian president, he was a military dictator. He was very corrupt. But interestingly, Tim, the economic growth was around 8% at the time. After the transition of democracy, the economic growth is 5%. How do we explain this? During the Suharto era, I hate to say this, the corruption was very efficient. You dealt with a single family. From the top to the lowest level to the bottom, everything will be settled by his family. The corruption was very efficient, was certain. And the business people, I hate to say this, for them, as long as it's certain, they are thinking about the cost benefit. As long as you return higher than your cost, you're going to jump in. But after the democratic transition in Indonesia, there is a fragmentation of power. So many power brokers. You have to deal with the central government, you have to deal with the parliament, you have to deal with the local government. So your transaction cost per bribe is increasing. There is one thing worse than organized corruption, which is unorganized corruption. In my view, this issue of governments need to be settled if you want to improve productivity. That's the first factor. The government should also increase their savings. It means that our tax ratio to GDP should be increased. Unfortunately, our tax ratio to GDP, Tim, now is around 9 to 10%. That is why it is important for us to increase the tax ratio, but this is not politically easy because if you raise the tax rate, then people will complain. So the best way to do it is to do administrative reform. And together with Rimahana, Ben Olken, and Mayara Felix, we published in VoxDev about how to increase the tax ratio, not by increasing tax rate, through the administrative reform. That's the second aspect. We can increase the savings by increasing the tax ratio, or to fill the gap of the saving investment by inviting the foreign direct investment. If the government is able to provide all this prerequisite, I do believe that we could achieve that 8% economic growth. But without that, it's not going to be easy for the government.
That's a real insight into the challenges of policymaking. Chatib, thank you very much for talking about that to us today.
Pleasure, Tim. Thank you very much.
This has been a VoxDev Talk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode is to follow us. You find us wherever you get your podcasts. All our past episodes, as always, at VoxDev.org, where there are also articles about the topics we feature. If you like what you hear, please tell someone else about us. Leave us a review as well. VoxDev Talks is a Talk Normal production. The assistant producer is Megan Bieber and our editor is Andrei Zargarian. Thanks to Oliver Haney and Iman Siddiq at VoxDev.